So this young blonde was a freshman in college, probably a second-year freshman, and she was taking U.S. history. And on the very first class day, the professor decided he wanted to ask a few questions of the students to see how much they knew about U.S. history. And he was going around and asking each one, what about this, or what's this, or some of these questions from U.S. history. And it came this young gal's turn, and he looked at her and he said, what is that famous decision, Roe versus Wade? And she paused a minute, and she said, I know this. And she thought for a minute, and she said, I know. And he said, okay, yeah, what is it? And she said, that's the decision George Washington had to make before he crossed the Delaware. Bad. Who said that? That's okay. I had a nice compliment this week. Last week you groaned at my joke, and somebody that was at home said, keep telling your jokes, because we were laughing at home. So thank you out there. The crossing of the Delaware on Christmas Day in 1776 changed the whole tone of the Revolutionary War. And some amazing things happened on that day. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those a little bit later. But the things that happened were so amazing that many Americans, at least those that believed in the revolutionary cause, in fact, probably most of them, viewed those events as providential, viewed those events as caused by God for a purpose, because he was bringing us the freedom that we so desired. And so when we celebrate on July 4th the freedom that we have, I believe we celebrate a freedom that God has given us. And we need to keep that in mind as we celebrate. But at this time together, we're studying the life of Moses, and we've been studying it for a number of weeks now. It'll take us all the way through the summer. And we've come to the event that gave the Israelite people their freedom. And so that's where we are. Maybe it's providential that we arrived at this part of the study on this day. Maybe the pastor had a little bit to do with manipulating that, but we won't say that. So no, we've come to that today, and I think it's no accident that we would think about their freedom on a day when we celebrate ours. That story is in Exodus chapters 12 and 13. And the event that we're talking about is called the Exodus. It's the event that gives this book its name. And even though the book doesn't spend a lot of time on the event itself, that is what gives this book its name. And we want to just ponder for a few minutes together today that event known as the Exodus. Exodus is a word that means going out. Particularly, it's used in English of a going out of a mass of people, a large number of people going out from something. When you exit a sporting event or a concert with lots of people, it could be called an exodus. But this is particularly a special exodus when the people of Israel left Egypt. I want to read to you just the beginning of this event and how that happened, and then think about some things we can learn from it. So I'm going to read to you from Exodus chapter 12, beginning in verse 29. This is actually what we talked about last week, is where it begins. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go and serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And then down in verse 37 it says, the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And a mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both their flocks and their herds. That's the story of the Exodus, of leaving Israel. But as Moses wrote this story, that's what it was, 600,000 men, it says, with their families, leaving their homes to go somewhere else. And that sounds like a pretty major event. It happened almost overnight because it was night when the firstborn were struck down. It was that very night when Pharaoh summoned Moses. Even though the last time Pharaoh had seen Moses, he said, I never want to see you again. He actually summoned Moses and said, get out of here. We're done with this. Take your people and go. Overnight, they went from an oppressed people to a sovereign nation. Overnight, they went from slavery to freedom. And I think that's why it's appropriate that we consider that story today. What struck me more than anything as I read through these chapters and pondered them this past week is that Moses, who wrote this, emphasizes one thing way more than everything else. He emphasizes one particular thing. And the thing that he emphasizes is this: the Lord did it. Yahweh did it. This wasn't our thing. This is something God did for us. And he emphasizes that over and over. In fact, there are 4 very specific things that he says this is what the Lord did. And I want to spend our time looking at those 4 things today and see what they can teach us. Number 1, it says this is what the Lord did. He struck down the firstborn in Egypt. He struck down the firstborn in Egypt. This was not some act of rebellion by thousands of slaves who were rising up and killing off their overlords. This was something clearly that God did. In the middle of the night, he went through, it says, and put to death all of the firstborn of the families of Egypt, including even their livestock and their animals. The death of the firstborn was a God-caused plague. It's what he did. He did it because Pharaoh's heart was so hard, it would take a major stroke to soften it and to humble him. I think only a blow like this could possibly do it because Pharaoh was so hardened. And finally he relented and he let the people go. Again, he did it that very night. He said, get up and get out of here. It's no wonder when those people celebrated the Passover dinner, God said, eat it in your traveling clothes, eat it packed and ready to go, because that very night they were told to leave Egypt. A question that I've heard asked before is this really fair or just? I've heard challenges. How can you worship a God who would put to death innocent children? How can you worship a God like that? And I think that's probably a fair question to ask. Was this really just or fair? Well, there's a few answers to that. First of all, I've already pointed out that Pharaoh was so hardened, it took a blow this hard to wake him up and soften him to who really is God and who is in control. But also, we can think of this possibly, as some people have said, as recompense for generations of slavery. For at least 2 generations and possibly more, the Israelites had been enslaved to the Egyptians. And this could be recompense for all that hardness. But I think the real issue is this. I think the real issue is that question comes from a very limited eyesight. It doesn't see the whole picture. I want you to think about it this way. If not everybody that put to death was children, some of them were younger adults by then. But think about the children for a minute. If these children really were innocent, then when they were put to death, they were ushered immediately into the presence of a holy and loving God. And they were never given a chance to grow up in a society that knew nothing about him. Think about that for a minute. That is not an act of judgment. That is an act of incredible grace. That's what that is. An act of incredible grace. And so when people challenge and say, how can you worship a God that would kill innocent people? I think the answer is that was an act of grace. Because had those children lived, they would have grown up in a place and in a society that made no recognition of God whatsoever and had no opportunity to know him. He struck down the firstborn in Egypt. Number 2, he gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. He gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Down in verse 35, Actually, verse 33, the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we'll all be dead. And then 35, the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and jewelry and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. And thus they plundered the Egyptians. Plundered is kind of a hard word, isn't it? Plundered. And I began to think about that. But again, you have to realize that these people were enslaved for generations. They were unpaid labor for many years. And the wealth that the Egyptians had is wealth that had come at the hands of the Israelites who were getting paid nothing for it. And this very well could be justice. God, as he always does, brings about perfect justice. And he did that by paying Israel for all their years of labor by the hand of the people they'd enriched by that. You know, with so much discussion in the news and in the world today about justice, one thing we can trust is that God will always bring about perfect justice. It may not be in this life, as it was for these Israelites, but God will always bring about his perfect justice, regardless of what injustices we see in the world. That's something we can put our trust and our hope in, is that very thing. And he gave these people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. He brought about justice by paying them for those years of labor. Number 3, this is what God did. He brought them out of Egypt. The last verse of chapter 12, and 4 times in chapter 13, it says the Lord brought them out. Listen to the last verse of chapter 12, verse 50. All the people of Israel did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, and on that very day the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. Look at chapter 13, verse 14. When in time to come your son asks you, what does all this mean? You wonder where that tradition at the Passover dinner of the son asking the question, why is this night different than all other nights? We talked about that last week. I think that tradition of the son asking those questions comes from this very verse. When your son asks you, what does all this mean? Because this is talking about that very feast. This is what you should say. By a strong hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. There's a couple of examples, again, once in chapter 12, 4 times in chapter 13. And there's another time that says, this is what happened when this is what the Lord did when we came out of Egypt. It was all the Lord's doing. You know, all these plagues were God's plan from the beginning. Maybe in some of our minds we think of it as God just kept coming up with worse and worse plagues because Pharaoh was so hard and he kept saying no. But all of these plagues were God's plan from the very beginning. He told Moses at the burning bush, it won't be until I do all kinds of miraculous judgments on Egypt before he'll let the people go. But God told Moses that again in chapter 4 after the burning bush. And then again in chapter 6, when Moses was at his lowest point, remember when we talked about Pharaoh telling the people to make bricks without straw, Moses' lowest point, he was pretty discouraged, and this is what God said to him. He said, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And the reason, he says, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. The reason God did all of these plagues, including this last one, was so the people would know for certain who he was. They would know that he was God. And so all of these plagues were a part of God's plan, including this last one, the death of the firstborn sons. He wanted people to know that he is the one who did it, that he brought them out, and they didn't do it of their own strength. You know, when something is said 6 times, you think maybe God wants us to get it? 4 times in chapter 13, once in chapter 12, and again that other one that says this is what the Lord did when we were brought out of Egypt. I think God wants us to learn that he did it. It wasn't Moses, it wasn't politics, it was God's work that did it. And God adds at this point in a couple of places, not only did I bring you out, but I will bring you into the land of Canaan. And twice he says, into the land of Canaan, as I swore to you. Then in chapter 13, verse 11, he says, I will give you that land. You see, God's doing all these acts and emphasizing that it was him should have given those people an incredible assurance that God would continue his promise and bring them into the land he said that he would give them. And so he did that so they would know him and that they would have that assurance. They would need that reminder when they spent 40 years in the wilderness because they were disobedient and didn't go directly to the promised land. They would need that reminder that it was God's hand that brought them out of slavery. And they would need that reminder just a couple days from this story. Just a couple days from now, they would need that reminder when they were in a hopeless despair because they seemed to be trapped. They would need that reminder that it was God who brought them out. It's interesting that it says that they took Joseph's bones with them. It had been 400 years since Joseph had ruled in Egypt. And chapter 13, verse 19 says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you and shall carry up my bone. You shall carry up my bones with you from here. 400 years before, Joseph said, God will bring you out of this land into the land he promised to my great-grandfather Abraham. And when he does, take my bones with you and bury them there with my ancestors. And you know what? The fact that they remembered that is proof that they never lost sight of God's promise to deliver them. They never lost sight of that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have remembered that promise to Joseph. But Moses remembered that, and they gathered Joseph's bones and took them into the promised land. God struck down the firstborn of Egypt. He gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. He brought them out of Egypt. Here's number 4. He went before them. He went before them. Chapter 13, verse 21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel both day and night. He went before them, and he did it in a clear, unmistakable way. Can you imagine that? Just that pillar of cloud in front of them, and at night it looked like fire. It was lit up. And they always had that. For 40 years that continued. And they always had that reminder that God was leading them. Even as they wandered through the desert and it seemed like they were lost, God was right there leading and had that constant reminder that he was the one who would lead them. For 40 years that was there. I love what the Puritan commentator Matthew Henry said about this. He says, now that they had come to the edge of the wilderness, they would have occasion for a guide. And a very good guide they had. One that was infinitely wise and kind and faithful. I think those are great words. They had need for a guide in the wilderness, and they had one who was infinitely wise. God did all these things for them. He struck down the firstborn in Egypt. He gave them favor in the sight of the Egyptians. He brought them out of Egypt, and he went before them so they would know where to go. He did it all. Well, not quite. There's one thing he didn't do. Look at chapter 3, verse 17. It says what God didn't do. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though that way was near. Here's what God didn't do. He didn't take them the shortest route into the promised land. He took them on a roundabout way. In fact, if you read ahead, and we'll see this next week, he led them directly into a trap. He led them directly into a trap. He didn't do that to trap them. He did that to prove to them once and for all that he was the one who delivered them. And he did an incredible act that they would never forget. That's what we'll talk about next week. That's going to take an entire sermon to look at. But he didn't lead them the direct way. He led them on a detour in order to show them that he really is God and that he really would deliver them. They still needed one more vivid lesson of that. And so God led them where they could get that lesson. By the way, if you feel like your life's on a detour, and I think almost everybody feels that way the last few months, if you feel like your life is on a detour, Sometimes God has purposes for detours in our lives because he wants to show us more of who he is, because he wants to show us his redemption, because he wants to teach us something that we need to learn. And so God took them on a detour for that reason. God does not always lead on the short route, but he always leads on the best one. And that's something that we can trust in. He always leads in the best way. So he did all these things for them. But there's something else Moses emphasizes every bit as much as the fact that God did it. He emphasizes how God did it. Because 4 times it says the same thing in this passage. To horribly misquote a famous movie line, one does not simply walk out of Egypt. One does not simply walk out of Egypt. Pharaoh was the most powerful person in the world. And he was dead set against the Israelites leaving. And so it reminds us in the passage 4 times that when God did it, he did it with a strong hand. With a strong hand. Remember I told you it says 4 times in chapter 13, the Lord brought us out? Every time it says the Lord brought us out with a strong hand. It was God's might, God's power that did it. I had to look up that phrase, strong hand. And then I looked up the phrase mighty hand in the Old Testament just to see how often they are used. The phrase strong hand is in the Old Testament 10 times. All of them are about God, not about anybody else. All 10 of those are about God. And 9 of them are about this very incident right here. That God did this with a strong hand. In the Old Testament, the words mighty hand appear 16 times. 16 times. All of them are about God. Not one of them is about anybody else. And 11 of those 16 are about this incident we just read. And so all the way through the Old Testament, God constantly reminded the people, 27 sometimes, I did it with a strong hand. We serve a mighty God who works with a mighty hand on behalf of his people. And that is, again, something we can put trust in. That God works with might on behalf of his people for freedom and for redemption. And that's what he did here. And so they had their freedom. So they had their freedom. They always looked back to this day as the day to celebrate the beginning of it all. This very day when those firstborn were killed and they went out. They also look back to the event that took place at the Red Sea a few days later, but this was the day they celebrated. That's why they had that Passover feast for generations to come and are still celebrating it today. It's this very day that they look to for freedom. You know, it's interesting, if you look back in the U.S. history at the, I just lost the word, the freedom of the slaves, at the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, when slaves were set free, they didn't always know what to do with it. They weren't too sure what to do with their freedom. Booker T. Washington, who grew up a slave, in his book Up From Slavery, says this. He talks about the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation at the plantation where he grew up and this incredible celebration that the people had. But then he said, within a few hours, the celebration died down. He said, freedom was a more serious thing than we'd ever thought. He said, we had to think and plan for ourselves and for our children. And after a few hours of celebration, the weight of having to plan their own lives and their children's lives began to weigh on them because they'd never had to do that before. They grew up being told what to do. They never had to make those decisions. And he said after a few hours of celebration, the weight of that freedom began to weigh on us. And a lot of people who were freed at the Civil War had no idea what to do with their lives. And it took a long time to get that sorted out. God did not leave his people in that situation. Because when they went out to freedom, he had a plan to give them his word. And another reason why he didn't take them the direct route to the promised land is, one, he'd promised God he would take them to Mount Sinai. And it was there at Mount Sinai that God gave them his word and how to live their lives as his people. And so he didn't leave them in that situation of not knowing what to do with their freedom. He told them exactly what to do with it. He gave them that direction. And so God set them free. God put to death the firstborn. God gave them favor, and God led them all the way. God did it all. And they had their freedom. On this weekend, when we talk about the freedom in our country, I can't help but wonder if this doesn't apply to that in a couple different ways. And there were a couple thoughts that I had that I want to share with you. I think one of them is something I already expressed, somewhat of opinion, and another is just kind of my heart of where I am at this point in time. I think there's two things we can learn. Number one, our freedom in the USA is something God did. It's something He gave us. I mentioned the Delaware crossing that changed the course of the Revolutionary War. Just a few days before, it was on Christmas Day, 1776. Just a few days before that, George Washington wrote to his brother these words in a letter, "I think the game is pretty near up." His army was leaving. The ones that were under contract, it was ending at the end of the year on December 31st. They had no supplies. Many of them had no clothes or shoes. I mean, they were to the very end. And that's what he said. The game is pretty near up. But some amazing things happened that Christmas Day in 1776. A storm came up, a bad storm that kept things well hidden and put the enemy almost to sleep, thinking nobody's going to be out in this kind of weather. There was a false report given to the enemy. By the way, the enemy that day was a German garrison that was helping the English forces. It wasn't the English. And a false report was given to the leader of that German force that the enemy was coming on Christmas Day. And they thought it was in the morning. And they went out and they explored it and found it to be a false claim. So they didn't believe any other claims that came later. In fact, the general or the commander of those forces gave a command to his forces, "Don't interrupt my Christmas card game." And they took him literally. Even locals who were favorable to their cause started bringing notes. "We've seen George Washington's army. They're coming." He wouldn't be disturbed by it. He just couldn't believe, and neither could any of his soldiers, that on a stormy day, on a Christmas day, that ragtag army across the river would be upon him. They simply could not believe it. And though Washington's army was hugely outnumbered, hugely outpowered, they won that battle in less than a couple of hours, with, I think, 2 or 3 losses of life and nothing more. It was just an amazing event that people look back on and said, God's hand was in that. And from that point on, the war took a different turn. And from that point on, people began to believe that God was really in this thing. God was really behind this revolution. I read a book a number of years ago by Benson Bobrick called Angel in the Whirlwind. The subtitle is The Triumph of the American Revolution. This is what he said. "There were so many unexpected turns in the war and providential escapes that the idea took hold that Washington's success depended ultimately upon some supernatural blessing and approving hand of God." That was the widespread feeling. Washington himself would not entirely have disagreed with that assessment and seemed often to speak of it humbly, convinced of it. He felt the revolution had been constantly rescued by a higher power. You see, things happened in such amazing ways that people had to say, God is behind this. How could a group of untrained farmers defeat the most powerful army in the world? Outnumbered, outpowered. They say this had to be the hand of God. I think our freedom is something that God gave us. But freedom is something that's hard to learn. Our pledge says justice, or liberty and justice for all. Our founding document says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We believe in liberty and justice for all. It took us some time to learn that liberty for all included black people. It took us some time to learn that liberty for all includes women. It takes even longer to learn justice for all. and to learn that justice for all includes all races and minorities of people. And I think we have to ask the question, as the primarily white, middle-class American church, have we, as the white church in USA, fought for justice in the ways that we can? I think when we think about justice and God's justice, we have to ask that question. Dr. Barry Howard is the pastor of not sure how to pronounce it, the Weka Road Baptist Church in Atlanta. He wrote an article called What Our Founding Fathers Meant by Liberty and Justice for All. And when he got to the part on justice, he said, justice is commonly perceived as the assignment of merited rewards and punishment. But the Old Testament prophets, especially Amos, knew that justice is so much more than being affirmed for right behavior and punished for wrong behavior. Justice strives to create viable opportunities for all persons to succeed economically, vocationally, and socially. Listen to that again. Justice strives to create viable opportunities for all persons to succeed economically, vocationally, and socially. Real justice seeks to create opportunities for those who are disadvantaged. That's what real justice does. It not only repays good and bad, it looks for equal opportunities for all, especially the disadvantaged. Have we, as white Americans, done that? I think we have to ask that question in order to truly fight for justice. I have to admit that I've learned over the last 2 years, and even more so over the last 2 months, that white privilege in our world is a real thing. It's a real thing. A Christian friend of mine posted this week, and it angered me. White privilege is just something invented by the minorities that don't want to work. But I've learned that white privilege is a real thing. When I talk to Christian believers who said, I'm an owner, or read Christian believers who say, I'm an owner of an appliance repair company, and at least 6 times a year, when I'm driving my truck after hours, I get stopped by police to say, is this really your truck? 6 times a year. And he has to pull out his incorporation papers. He's learned to carry them with him to say, yeah, this is my business and this is my van. I heard a story of a black Christian person who was arrested because he was walking through the neighborhood behind his as they were building it and looking at the layouts of the houses. Not one white person was ever arrested for that. You know, when they built the neighborhood behind our house, we'd go over there about once a month, once every 2 or 3 weeks, and walk through the houses behind us to look at the floor plans to see what was being built. People do that all the time. We never got questioned, but this family got questioned simply because of the color of their skin. You see, white privilege is a real thing in our country. And we have to ask as Christian people, are we truly fighting for justice for all? That's a tough question to ask. It's one that convicts me because I haven't been there most of my life, and I don't know what to do with that except to continue to be open to it and ask God, how can we pursue justice? If we truly believe in freedom that God gives us, and if we truly believe that freedom is for all, then we need to fight for that, even for those less privileged. But you know what? Ultimately, this is not a story of political freedom. Ultimately, this is a story that foreshadows true spiritual freedom. Because God looks back at this event and says, Christ is your Passover lamb. The one who sets us free from the slavery to sin is Jesus Christ. And ultimately, when we look at this story, we have to say, have we experienced that freedom? Do we trust in Jesus and know that he frees us from the power of sin? Let's pray together. Lord, as we look at this study, we celebrate freedom. We celebrate the freedom they were given. We celebrate the freedom that you give us in Christ that this foreshadows, and we celebrate the freedom you've given us in our nation. But unfortunately, it's hard because we've been asked a tough question. Do we really believe in liberty and justice for all? Do we really believe that all men are created equal? Lord, you've taught me a lot about this over the last few years and the last few months. And I just pray you'd continue to teach us. And in doing so, open our eyes to opportunities to speak for justice for all. Opportunities to speak up that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights from you. Grant us that by your Spirit, because at least in my sinful self, I couldn't do it. And yet, even where we fall short, we thank you for the spiritual freedom that comes from Christ, that he has set us free from the tyranny of sin. And we worship you in that.